Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is the one and only just Catherine Keller, or JC. I'm so excited you're here, and I'm thrilled that you're a part of Christianity in Process. And with like almost 2,000 people already a part of a group learning process theology with John Cobb, and each week we get to feature a different process theologian who. Any of us that are in that tribe obviously are inheriting his legacy, but you have in a unique way compared to the other people that will be joining. So I thought it would be a fun way to begin is for you to tell us about your own story up to meeting John on a page. And if I remember correctly, from 13 years ago when we first talked, in reading John and reading Whitehead, you discovered the divine eros. And I'd love to hear the origin story of Catherine Keller, theologian.
Well, thank you, Trip. I guess it'll be another podcast when we can discuss what got us together 13 years ago and the origin story.
Well, I think it was John. I think I told John, I really want to interview Catherine Keller. And he goes, oh, well, I'll give you her email address. I think it was a blind podcast date from John Cobb.
And I had been hearing of you from him for some time before that. He always referred to you as the internet genius. So, that was very intimidating to me because it took me decades to get at home with the internet. So, so the story of the origin of my connection to process theology, and in some sense then to theology in a serious way. Right. Well, this is way back. It's in St. Louis. I was in a very complex moment. I didn't have a college degree. I had come back from Germany to kind of help my family out in St. Louis. They were suffering from dysfunction that had gone on for all of my life. But it had come to a head. My stepfather was not able really to hold on to his job as a sort of part-time minister, actually, at that time. He sometimes used his training in Europe to then have gigs as a pastor temporarily. He was from Germany and had been drafted into Hitler's army and had managed to flee. A life of tragedy and complexity back there, and then emotional craziness with my mother, and I was the oldest of four of us. So I had just been off in Europe. I had dropped out of Harvard after a year because I wanted to study with a particular philosopher of religion in Heidelberg, and my family had been over in Germany for a while, so I used that as a stopping place. And then they were back, and I stayed on in Germany. But quit to come back to help. And I didn't finish a degree, but my family never finished degrees. So I was just in that situation in St. Louis, wondering how to make a go of things. And a denominational connection opened up, and I met someone at Eden Seminary, and that drew me right in to Eden Seminary. And they admitted me right away. They didn't care that I didn't have a degree, and actually made me stay and get one, even though I was about to pop off to Berkeley after a couple of years. Good old Alan Miller convinced me to just stay put, get a degree, break the family karma. But I learned from Alan Miller about Paul Tillich, from Gerald Schlosser about Jung. I had a lot of exposure through Brueggemann there to liberation theology in relation to the Hebrew scriptures. So it was a rich moment. Doug Meeks and ethic. Eden was really thriving. And that was great for me. But then there was a class where Alan Miller did introduce us to some Whitehead. And it was, in fact, Adventures of Ideas, in which God is referred to as the eros of the universe. And I was just like, whatever, 23. So that definitely stirred me up, this erotic God. And it just happened that then that was my second to last semester, and I was in the bookstore, and there was a book by a process theologian I had heard something about, Christ. Oh, I have it right here. Christ in a Pluralistic Age had just come out. This is about 1974 we're talking about. And I just sat on the floor, the basement floor of that bookstore, reading this book for a couple of hours. So I had my call. There was this understanding of Christ as operative in modern abstract art. I knew a lot about abstract art from my family. That's what my mother had done for a while. The lure of God, which is called then Christ by Cobb, is in this abstract art. And then another chapter on how the lure of God is in Buddhism and luring us as Christians to learn something from the Buddha to get over our Christian egotism. This all blew me away. And again, this is barely the mid-70s, a whole environmental chapter in there too on Arco Santi. So off I went to Claremont. Fortunately, it became actually possible rather quickly.
Well, I know the feeling of discovering process thought, reading a lot of John Cobb, and deciding you should go to Claremont. When I went there for the Summer Process Institute after my senior year of undergrad, I took a class with Marjorie Suhaki, and if you are a Baptist preacher's kid from the South and someone was to do a revival and lure you into process thought, Marjorie Suhaki is about as good as it gets to do it.
Oh, beautiful, yes.
And then the second half of the day, you had a class with John Cobb. So like after spending time with both of them, I was like, oh, this coming here is like the best decision I've ever made in my life. Look at this, it's wonderful. And so
Providence.
so you spent time in Europe. You didn't finish degrees and were wrestling with it. And then it was something about the kind of a web of questions and influences and process thought that seized you enough, right, to one move and then to finish and then set you off on this career. Like at what point or was there a particular question or insight where the passion seized you that then it kind of demanded the kind of response people think of today when they think Catherine Keller? They think, oh, you get a question, and then you're like, yeah, she's going to do the process response. She's going to do the feminist response. She's going to do the queer response. She's going to include multiple disciplines. And then when it comes out, you're going to go, I couldn't have written that. And I wish I could, but I don't have a mastery of language like that. And then you just feel kind of incompetent as a scholar when you get done reading a Catherine Keller book because it's so overwhelming. And then you go like, where was the passion that sets off on someone to do this? Like, what was that first big question or topic where you go, oh, I'm going to sit with this and I'm going to wrestle with this and I'm going to find a way to weave my intuitions and research and wrestling onto the page?
And by the way, I am not proud of having made you feel incompetent. I hope that at some point that reversed itself and any influence I had contributed to your empowerment.
Well, I don't think I'll ever write text as beautiful and as insightful at the same time. I just record myself talking a lot.
Invent an internet site that influences tens of thousands of people. Nor will I probably run a single podcast. But okay, different competences.
Oh yeah, different, and I like yours.
Thank you, and I'm really profoundly respectful and indebted to yours. So, what was that question? Well, it is something like what I just named about the combination of modern abstract art, which was a deep and crazy part of my autobiography. I won't go all into it. My blood father's name was Milton Cohen, and he was an artist, abstract. But that marriage didn't last. He wanted to create, not procreate. And so Jules Keller then was another influence. But that was in my original life, the formation for abstract art. So John Cobb's, moving in through Malraux and his whole history of the development of modern art was amazing for me. That, Andre Malraux's work in art history shows that there's a very meaningful process of Christ being depicted through medieval art, and then the disappearance of Christ from art gradually until by the 19th century, there's very little landscapes, portraits, historical other scenes. And John Cobb goes with Malraux most of the way, but for Malraux, that's the liberation of art and modernity from that Christological hegemony. But then John's move to say that it's actually Christ that's calling art away from the icons of Christ, that it's actually the lure of God as Christ, this logos, calling artists to do this modern art, this iconoclastic art, this avant-garde art with its iconoclasm in relation to traditional images. I think that is the initial really autobiographical hook into the art stuff. But it's that sense of it, more broadly speaking, of God as lure, of God's work, and indeed God's work through and in what we call Christ as this logos, this cosmic principle that's in all things. That sense of that divine cosmic principle as never working omnipotently, but invitingly, sometimes tragically failing to get the attention of certain creatures, probably especially human ones, at least on this planet, that call keeps coming. Well, that understanding of that divine lure was what lured me then to Claremont. I'd like to say it was really the divine lure luring me to Claremont to work with John Cobb. At the very least, it was John Cobb's idea of Whitehead's idea of the divine lure that lured me.
Well, the concept of the lure, I think, is really important and helpful for kind of getting a picture of how the concept of God in process thought differs from kind of the popular concept of God and a lot of the historic concept of God that shaped much of Christian history. When you think of the kind of baggage God, in scare quotes, brings, that a process vision helps us set aside, are there particular parts of it that when you set it aside, you felt, oh, this is liberating? Or are there parts of it when you set it aside for maybe intellectual, philosophical, scientific reasons, you go, what do we do without that?
Well, because of the way I grew up, I mean, I wasn't shaped by any traditional religious framing. It was a very occasional and inadvertent Christianity that was filtered oddly. So the loss of that controlling omnipotence was never any kind of personal loss for me. But I was entering into a world more and more consciously where a lot of people I cared about did have more traditional beliefs and went through crises of faith. I remember one, this is that now back before the choice to go to seminary, but I was in junior high. We were in Atlanta for those couple of years. So I'm close to Emory, actually. Right, Decatur. I was in 8th grade, and a friend of mine who I wished would take me on a date, and I invited him to come to the Hayride my church group was organizing. He didn't take me up on that. He was older and responsible, but we did have good conversations.
Well, if you ever ask me to go to a hayride, Catherine, I'm more than happy to go. I might not be very much fun.
Thank you very much. I'll invite your whole family, in fact, Trip.
All right. That's what I like to hear.
I'm in the neighborhood with a hayride. But it was I who was a member of that Methodist church that did hayrides, not my family at that point. No, just me. But the conversation I had with him about church then, and really why he didn't want to do it, was transformative for me. He was quiet at first, then he burst out into a rage saying, how could I possibly believe in a God who let my sister die miserably at age 13 from cancer? And he just went stony silent. And I went silent and just took that in deeply, that he had grown up understanding, that even if God isn't in control, at least God would intervene when it's really important. So he's just smashed and cold. And then he made clear to me he would always be an atheist. And I didn't try arguing with him, but and I didn't try getting him to come to the Hayride anymore either. But I went without a date. But he sticks with me clearly, and that began to open me to that experience of people who have grown up with different degrees of the omnipotent deity. Some of them think that God controls everything that happens. There are the most extreme kinds of Calvinists, for instance. Calvin did once say the very torque of each snowflake's twisting and falling is predetermined from all eternity. So there's that sense of divine, totally controlling omnipotence. And then there are degrees of it to where there's lots and lots of freedom, like God gives us enough rope to hang ourselves, but God could always intervene. God has that capacity to always intervene and save us from the worst. And so when terrible tragedies happen, these Christians just understandably feel so betrayed. So I didn't have that personal experience. I had a lot of chaos and kind of tragedy in my life, but I didn't have that notion of a controlling deity. But as I began to have my own understanding of God as a loving, supportive presence that had always been helping me get through the family chaos and the constant moves. We had to move every couple of years, more or less, and it was around the world. It involved Africa and Greece, and a lot of places. So there were gifts in that too. But I felt God as the one who somehow lured me along in ways that were allowing me some serenity and some calm, and helped me to make friends in each new place and not grieve too much about having to leave friends when we moved again. So I was feeling God as supportive and helpful, but I was coming to understand this other God that leaves people feeling so disappointed, so betrayed. So you can see how that kind of prepared the ground for process theology.
Yeah. And one of the things about the stories you tell, the two things that pop out, the experiences to make sense of, right, is a peer sharing a story where they make the insistence that whatever God means, you shouldn't use the word if it means God let or willed this to happen to his sister. Yeah. And it's hard not to resonate with that. Right. And then on the other side is the experience of your own experience of God through the flux of growing up. And then you encounter, when you hang out in seminary, the fact that actually the official version of God might be too strikingly similar to the one that was running through your friend's head, right? When he's like, yes, no, I can't do that. Right. And I think that for a lot of people that ask those questions and have that experience of divine intimacy and such, it's not surprising they end up resonating with process thought. But I also think that, like, anyone that takes the friend's testimony seriously has to ask, like, when Christians use the word God, is that God even as nice as Jesus? And so often that's not the case. They're like, I guess Jesus was really good PR because the Father, he's pissed, or lazy, or, but he's definitely powerful, of course.
That's well expressed, right? You got kind of this sweet son, but the dad dude, he's patriarchal, and, really quite dangerously aloof, overbearing, somehow all controlling, but not at all trustworthy. And yet it's a sin not to trust, not to put absolute faith. So yeah, gradually, even if one hasn't grown up shaped by versions of that stereotype that I painted, one comes to understand the power of it. It would be easy to understand why some people just do give up on Christianity, even if they haven't had that single kind of tragic experience of contradiction, that they just think in a more general sense. It just doesn't, it just doesn't make sense. The notion of this, this omnipotent God who's supposed to also be all loving, and yet the Holocaust. Need I say more? I mean, so thinking people just routinely have been giving up on God, through the whole 20th century, and it continues into this one. And any new round of horrors like now climate change, the war in Ukraine, COVID, is causing, endless people to lose faith. Any kind of God who's good and who's the creator, who's in control of the world, wouldn't let these things happen. Yeah, so it's understandable to us process theologians that lots of people just give up on their faith, Christian or any kind of Abrahamic faith. It's very understandable that they just don't encounter a good alternative. And so we try to make that available.
Well, you've mentioned a few words, and like lure, right? Or that God's present in suffering and things like that. Process theism in general has a host of words they use in trying to talk about the God-world relationship. Like sometimes process people use panentheism, and you have a wonderful new article out about that you authored with Austin Roberts, who was in the first time I ever taught systematic theology. So
cool.
I know. I'm always like, you're my star pupil. Anyway,
lovely.
we're almost the same age. He spent time as an actual professional like guitarist before graduate school.
Right.
That's how he reminds me. He's so cool. Anyway, you had the panentheism. You got lure. Whitehead talks about diporality and the primordial and consequent nature of God. And I mean, there's so many things about this, about Whitehead's metaphysical system. I would love for you to take time to spell out how you see that all that those language and concepts helping to answer the kinds of questions that drove you and made process a home for you as a thinker, right? Like for people that are just now hearing a lot of Whitehead's vocabulary, and then the way John develops the logos and the creative transformation stuff, like how would you describe the God-world relationship in ways that were compelling to kind of, in a sense, lure everyone to spend more time with them?
Yeah, thank you. That interrupt me if I go on too long. You asked.
Interrupt you as if you talk about Whitehead's concept of God and what's alluring you. If I do that, Catherine, I will have to ground myself. All right. I just want you to know, all day long, I was like, I'm going to ask this question.
Okay. I don't doubt that God lured you to ask it, but what if God lures you to interrupt me?
We'll see what the initial aim is.
That's right. So I should say, just, in terms of that, those background motivations, that experience of the contradiction with suffering was big. After that period of my life, by the time I was finishing high school, I had become a feminist. That was then in the early 70s. And I went to seminary as a feminist. And because I got some signal that there was something called feminist theology that was just beginning, like the first book by Rosemary Redford Ruther was out. And there was Mary Daly's Beyond God the Father that exploded just as I went to seminary. So the feminist question, the criticism of God as a big patriarch in heaven, that was already really important to me before process thought. And I was drawn to mysticism, and that was before. So just to have that force field clear, that then was really needing an understanding of God if I was going to stay a Christian, that was not about the divine patriarch and his super son. And so I was very fortunate to encounter through this divine era, this opening into Whitehead and then to John Cobb, a whole new understanding of the God-world relationship. And I am quite comfortable calling it panentheism. I think John Cobb doesn't really like to use that language so much, but it's not a deep disagreement. But the notion of panentheism, that all is within God, fits, I think, with my mystical sensibility, sort of this divine infinity in which everything lives and breathes and has its being, though most of us are pretty unconscious of it most of the time at this time. So that basic sense of all being in God, and God, therefore, being in all, and all things being in all things in some interestingly, endlessly varied and perspectival way. That's very mystically meaningful to me. And I found that in this process vision of the relationship of God to the world, a relationship that's beginningless and endless. And that startles people, that we don't have just this sort of once for all creatio ex nihilo, the creation from absolutely nothing at some single point of time or the beginning of time by an absolute omnipotent act of will. That's the traditional view. I've written a whole book demonstrating that it's not the biblical view and that it's not the process view. Face of the Deep, that looks at that second verse of Genesis. There's no nothing there. There's already the earth, tohu vabohu, the earth in a kind of preformed state, and there's darkness over the face of this endless deep, and there's the spirit hovering over the mayim, the sea. There's no nothing. There's an eternal God eternally in relationship to this potentiality, and there is a point where it begins to take the form of this world, this universe, and who knows what other ones there have been or are. Yeah, but this one, yes, this one bangs on in. And that sense of God not creating from an absolute nothing, that's crucial in process theology. And the world doesn't just then unfold from an absolute nothing to some absolute ending, the end point. And I've written a couple of books on the apocalypse, showing that the biblical apocalypse is not the end. It's the end of the book, but it's a new beginning. And it's not just some supernatural thing after everything's destroyed. No, there's lots of destruction, as there has been and as there will be, but it's not an absolute ending any more than an absolute beginning. And that's very Whiteheadian. I've just tracked it out in more biblical terms over the course of my thinking and writing, communicating with folk. So the sense of the God-world relationship is everlastingly going on. That God's always entangled in some kind of creative process, and therefore in some kind of creation. Might be totally different than ours. Might be some world with 18 dimensions or 2 dimensions, who knows, beyond our conception. But in our world, that creative process goes on and on and on and on, billions of years. We know about billions of likely galaxies now as well. So it's an almost unfathomably creative unfolding. But what's so meaningful about it is it's not just the absolute controlling, starting point, moving to the absolute controlling final judgment and then supernatural bliss. that's too simple. that there is this creative involvement that characterizes the whole divine process with the world. Of course, this probably picks up on that chaotic early formative art in my family life, and this process with Whitehead is never purely orderly. He said, so complexity for him emerges at the edge of chaos. And that's just like Genesis 1-2, because the tohu vavohu is right there. Vavohu is right there. So that fit me personally in my life, the sense that this divine creative engagement is at the edge of chaos. It's calling forth fresh forms of order from chaos. Like, I didn't know what I was going to say in response to your question. There's a kind of watery chaos that is my mind all the time, a kind of darkness over the face of it. And you ask a question and it calls forth, some kind of response. And so our conversation is creating its own order right now, but it's a fresh order. It's not one we have all worked out in advance. Our past work comes into it, our past worlds, our past stages of this relationship, but something fresh is unfolding. And maybe what we call God is inviting that. So that's what I see happening. God is inviting and experiencing everything happening in the world. That all sounds terribly positive. And of course, a lot of things that are happening in the world are, but a lot of things are not nearly as positive as like this conversation. There's a war going on. There's unbearable suffering in the world going on. What's so important about process theology is God's there in that suffering. God's still calling to every being suffering. God is not the cause of that suffering. God has called forth and keeps calling forth a very free world with increasing levels of freedom. Because the more complex the creature is, the more choices it has to make. The more rich the complexity of a world or of a society or of a creature, the more room for error there is. The more creative possibilities there are, the more possibilities for destruction. And so we're in a world that's way more full of destruction than a universe where maybe there would just be little quantum electronic bursts of energy. That might be very lovely, but and very vibrant. But God has apparently been interested in calling forth really interesting worlds, and apparently finds more interesting these levels of creative freedom. So what's important is that God seems to be encouraging the creativity, but not controlling its outcomes. So that the shadow side, the destructive potential's always there. And so this other thing that's so important in process thought, in addition to the idea of the lure, the initial aim from God, is that whatever happens in response to God's moment by moment call to every creature, mostly unconsciously, whatever happens in response, God feels it. God doesn't just know it. God isn't just some cognitive apparatus of the universe. God is moved by everything that happens. So we hear it's not Aristotle's unmoved mover, but Charles Hartshorne, John Cobb's teachers, most moved mover. God is moved by everything that happens, which means God is affected. God feels whatever happens. And that means that God suffers with those who suffer. So God doesn't fix it. God isn't the fix-it man of the universe. God isn't there to take control. And that's what an intervention is. God can just keep calling other creatures, others to come to support. God can call forth more compassion, more love in others if they will respond. But God doesn't fix it. God calls for the repair of the world, tikkun olam, but God doesn't do it. But God feels with the feelings of the creature. So this compassionate God, this is very different from the dispassionate God that so many of us have received from our traditional Christianity. So it's a passionate and compassionate relationship to the world. It's not dispassionate. And yet in its passion and its compassion, this divine engagement is never that of control. It's always that of relation, of internalization, and then calling to the new moment, offering the new possibility, offering perhaps a better possibility.
Let's do a brief technical question. In a moment of God and the world interacting, how do you understand in your process perspective the role of the past coming into it, the role of the lure coming towards it, and you mentioned in what you were saying the creature's agency, the complexity of the creature and its attentiveness, like where it's directing its kind of consciousness, changes the kind of the level of responsiveness. How would you describe that? Because I feel like that is of one of those, I don't know, nuggets of insightfulness that when you understand how a process thinker is picturing the way the past and the possible, in some sense, kiss in each moment of becoming, then you can start to work out a lot of the theology. But that's one of the unique parts I think about a process panentheism, is it's not about space, where there's some infinite space and all the finite things are in it, and yet your nice substance is wrapped up in an infinite substance. The panentheism is something that happens moment to moment, all these little God world kisses. And you see how much eros of the divine insistence finds existence in the response.
Yeah, it is a very intimate presence of the infinite in every finite moment of experience. Yeah, so it's not a great static infinite spatiality, but it's the space-time of happening, of a happening. Yeah, it's a cosmic happening, and there are billions times billions of happenings. But our focus is always drawn to what's happening here now, because here now is in some sense receiving everything that has already happened in the universe, but from a very limited perspective. So yeah, no, you asked the question beautifully. It's really a question about the past, the present, and the future, because into each present moment of becoming, which is what the creature is, that's what you are, isn't it? That's what I am. We are moments of becoming right now, and right now, and right now. So you, Trip, are slightly different from the Trip of a moment ago and a moment ago and a moment ago. And I'm slightly different. Not so different that we need to change our names, but there's continuity. There's rigorous, deep continuity. But for Whitehead, for process thought, the actual occasion, the actual subject is the event here and now, that is sheer present tense. But that sheer present has what as its content? The whole past, its whole history. So the past flows in. That's our relations. Even you are in my past. There, it takes a split second for my retina my hearing to process the wavelengths, visual and auditory, coming from you. Oh, that's true for anything we can see with our senses. It takes some split seconds to process. So everything that is the content of the present is an influx from the past, the immediate past, but also the deep past. I mean, I've already been talking about the really deep past, like close to 7 decades past of my family history, my own personal participation in it. And all of that's present, as is yours. And what you were telling me about your family vacation coming up and those plans, that's already part of your family history, even though those are plans. So and it's part of my history now because I heard the story. So we have the whole history of ourselves, our families, our friends, our communities, but our nations, our planet as well, and our universe in some way, but ever more abstract. That whole history flows kind of oceanically, like a great roll of a wave into the moment. The wave of the universe and its past crashes on the shores of the present moment. And so that past we take in, but we have to integrate it somehow, mostly unconsciously. We can't process very much consciously. We can process some of what we're perceiving, some of what we remember, some of what we feel but don't consciously remember. We process as much as we can, moment by moment. And sometimes we're much more limited than other times, and sometimes limited by traumas or by terrible educations or by formations that screen out a whole lot. Sometimes we're gifted with the richer sense of the past flowing in with all of its complexity. That past flows into that sheer present, and we try to do what we can to integrate it and organize it. It's called the Conquests, becoming concrete, to make it concrete in this actually concrete occasion of becoming. But what's making that really possible? Well, in process theology, there's that lure. There's that lure. And what is that lure? That lure that is the divine calling, that whisper of the divine. Well, it's a whisper of new possibility, of fresh possibility, of something not already exactly realized in the past, something fresh, possible here and now that will allow me to integrate that past a little better than I would on my own. If I can just somehow feel that lure, somehow take it in. In a way, you can say God is calling us from the future, but it's not a pre-established, already set future. It's God offering possibilities for a richer future out of this endless artist palette of possibilities that God carries and offers, so that there's that lure of the future that calls us to integrate the past more meaningfully and in a way that will then offer itself more positively, more constructively, more healingly to the future. So it's always an incredible dance, isn't it?
Yeah.
Between the past and the future that you in the present have to do, but you becoming already the next and the next and the next moment of your present. So it's an incredible temporality that is just so rhythmic. The universe is just such a rhythmic dance for Whitehead, but it's a dance of the present tense that is taking in the endless chorale of the past and moving towards future. Not a preset future. That's why it's not a finalist kind of eschatology, a preset endpoint, but it is its own eschatology. There is constantly this calling of the future to the present, making something new out of the past.
I love that. But I mean, I'm not surprised I do. You just demonstrate to me that you are indeed Catherine Keller, and the way
but different moment by moment.
I know, but there's enough coherence. Like Joe Bracken would say here is Joseph Bracken, who's another week you'll get a visit, would say that you deserve the title Society. Because of the constancy of character and the provocative response. So you mentioned earlier having spent some time working at Face of the Deep and the doctrine of creation. And when you describe, right, the way you just did, that every moment in some sense is this meeting of the past and the possible futures and the creaturely contribution in the present. When you mentioned kind of the creation out of nothing isn't even in the Bible, that implies that it showed up in the tradition for a reason. Right. And you also in the book spend some time contrasting what's happening in Genesis with what happens in the Enuma Elish, which I mean, I read it in high school, so I imagine a lot of people are, it was a sign. I probably then wouldn't have been reading pagan text, but nonetheless, they were there. I'd love for you to take some time to talk about how, as a process theologian and a feminist and someone that engages in kind of deconstructive reading of text, how Whitehead helps you look at the actual Hebrew text in Genesis, and then the kind of criticism of abstractions and the criticism of inherited interpretations of that text. It helps you pull it back to then discover this kind of generative creativity with the chaosmos and such that in some sense was getting echoed in your previous answer. But for those that may not be familiar with the Genesis text and then the connection with its historical section, its historical connections, and then the kind of criticisms that feminists bring to that depiction of power and violence and such. Give us an invitation to what was going on in that work.
I do find I return to that work often because the question of the creation is constantly with us, isn't it? And it haunts many of us because we think about the creation now in its particular terrestrial form as very fragile. We think about it environmentally and in terms of climate change. And so it becomes important in new ways to think through the story of creation. The story of creation that a lot of us received is thought to be biblical. It's just, if you look seriously at Genesis 1, it doesn't map onto it. But, biblical passages are all there to be interpreted. They're rich and very ancient metaphors. So ex nihilo is fair game as an interpretation. It's just not fair to say that it's the only possible true interpretation. But yeah, so most folk are taught to see a God of total power creating everything out of nothing. And of course, it's a he God. And that was a patriarchal time in human history. So I'm not saying the Bible wasn't patriarchal. It's just that, it presumes the maleness too, because men were in charge of the social orders, and Israel would have been in big trouble. It's already big enough trouble, but if it hadn't, drawn on its patriarchal forces. So that's in there, the patriarchy. But very differently than, say, the Enuma Elish, which was a very influential Babylonian text, Babylonian Sumerian, and typical of other ancient texts where you have actual warrior gods. You have Marduk as a young warrior god, a son of Tiamat, who's the sort of original goddess giving birth to the world. But he decides to lead a revolt against her. Imagine that. He actually leads a little divine army of the children of Tiamat to kill her, to consider her a monster and to kill her and to take over the universe. And that's enshrined as divine truth in then these great civilizations, Sumeria and Babylon. So that's truly patriarchal power, warrior power of control. And then he creates the world, in his own image. But you don't have the warrior creation in Genesis. You have this calling forth out of the chaotic womb-like salt water of the Tehom, the deep. And you have God then step by step calling forth, saying, let there be, let there be. It's not the language of a commandment. It's the language of invitation. Let there be light. And there was light. And what does God say? He says, oh, it's good. It's like God responds with this delight to what comes forth from God's calling. So I read it as very Whiteheadian, as God is luring, giving out these possibilities, for light, and then for materialization of actual planetary and stellar bodies, and then for creatures of different kinds and complexities. And the elements cooperate. God asks the waters to bring forth once the waters have come forth, and then the earth has come forth. God asks the earth also to bring forth creatures. So God seeks as much collaboration as possible in that creative process. And it's always calling, and then saying, ooh, good. And then when it's all together manifest, that's when God says, oh, very good. Some Christians grow up thinking it's because we've been created in the image of God. That's why God says very good. No, it's all things together. God saw that it's very good, including us, very special, interesting creatures. So you can see how I got all into that exegesis of that text, because it seemed to suggest an alternative kind of power, even though it's, from about 3,000 years ago, possibly, or at least 2,500. It's still patriarchal, but it's opening up to another understanding of power that feminist theologians could work with. We didn't have to just cut ourselves off from the from the biblical tradition. We could hear something calling there and see how it keeps calling and finds perhaps its most radically gentle voice in Jesus of Nazareth, and how that calling, where God's creation then in one of the parables is like a seed being sown. That's the power of God to just distribute seeds. It's a perfect image of the divine lure. These seeds of possibility are distributed, and it's up to us to respond. And we might respond like stone, or like hard ground, or like something with thorns on it, or we might respond like good earth and really let this divine lure take root in us and grow with us. So it's sort of how I do my own feminist, Christian theological reading of the Bible in process terms.
One of the things that strikes me about what you just said is, in many ways, both in thinking through the parables and the way it depicts divine presence and activity, thinking through the Genesis text, is that there are unspoken presuppositions that lie at the heart of most of the kind of the dominant imperial, patriarchal, friendly Christianity, right? Yeah. Like, and one of the things you do, I think, well, in both of those examples is even the Genesis text, you're like, well, there's the sea, there's the formless void, and all that's prior to anything happening. Like, that's just like, you're like, well, if you take the Bible literally, right, there's all these things there. God is second. And then, and that's not you projecting. That's like just reading, right? And the text does not say God creates them, right? The sea and the formless void, but creates within them. And so in some sense, the legacy of hierarchy, patriarchy, this top-down coercive interventionist logic of the one power, turns the primal chaos into a threat. And it's not a threat to creation. It's the very place creation takes place. And I think that same kind of thing happens when you take the teachings of Jesus, or, in the parable of the seeds, or there's so many places where the actual language of Scripture describes something that coheres much more closely to a process vision. But then those unspoken presuppositions we have then tell us, like, well, as you begin to exegete this text, here are the assumptions we should begin with.
Yeah.
What has been your experience as someone that has spent years introducing kind of critical, faithful reflection on the Christian tradition to future ministers at coming up against those unspoken presuppositions? What does it mean to wrestle with them in positive ways? Because I imagine some people taking this class, spending 6 weeks with John, hearing from different process theologians, are like, oh, I love this stuff. This is amazing. Oh, we're going to talk to Catherine. This is great. Others are sitting there with those presuppositions they've internalized and assumed, like, this has to be. And then they probably already pulled out their Bible to make sure that we weren't making that up, you know?
Yeah.
So as someone who doesn't just think process and theologically, but the process of teaching, do you have wisdom as to how we process undoing and thinking through those unspoken presuppositions?
Well, you clearly do, and I really appreciate your approach to this set of problems and others, and you do it by asking lots of great questions, and you do that endlessly in endless contexts. And I think when I'm having a good teaching day, I'm asking some good questions too, and yeah, I might lecture a lot in a classroom, but I think also we have a lot of time for conversation, because it's very important to me, especially in classes that are more introductory, for students to be able to really express their presuppositions, to express where they think their faith is, and therefore also to articulate their problems with new ideas that are coming up. And, of course, there's students that come to Drew who are just really excited to be in a good, liberal progressive environment where there's all kinds of shattering of traditional presuppositions going on. That's felt to be very emancipatory. But a lot of our students are coming, from strong evangelical backgrounds, that they've been, for some reason, called to Drew, very different reasons. Sometimes maybe it's just the geography is convenient, or a friend went there, but they bear with them a lot of traditional Protestant beliefs. And if they're people who are coming to seminary, it's often because their faith has really been powerfully supportive for them, has been really meaningful. Else they probably just have left the church in general behind. So we have a lot of students who have had good, strong, and conservative Christian backgrounds, but end up studying with us. A significant percentage of our African-American students, which is a significant percentage of who we are now, would say they have something like that they've had a quite conservative kind of Christianity, and it's been life-giving and life-saving for them amidst, the oppressive circumstances of racism. So that's just all to say that, strategically, if I want a class to take process theology seriously, and it's a situation where they're being introduced to it, it's different maybe if it's a class that's called process theology, then they already have some desire to do it. But if it's a broader kind of introduction, I really want to tread lightly with, the concept of omnipotence and all, because they presume the all-powerful God, and that gives them comfort and a feeling of safety and security and meaning. So I think what happens is how that begins to work out is that, I do emphasize with no problems from them that the only two actual definitional statements about God in the Bible are God is spirit and God is love. Those are the two God is statements, the two definitional statements. No one disagrees. There are lots of other characterizations, but that seems very clear. And so we agree that that's a starting point. God is spirit and God is love. And so then the question is, so what kind of power is that is love? What is love power? And I get them to think of examples in their life of love power. And then someone will raise, I don't have to do it, the question of God's having all the power that there is. And then I can ask, does that feel like love power? Does having control over everything feel like the same as love? Like, can you think of relationships where it's like that? And yes, they can. When you're a baby, your parents are in control, and that's good. So we go from there. And yes, so what about when you begin to grow in faith? So that's how the conversation kind of unfolds, to try to think God's power in terms of God's love. And in that context, the crises of faith will begin to get expressed. And those will be there, the big questions that people have about how God could let this, and this happen if God's in control. So on the one hand, we have this positive sense that God is love, whatever else we can say about the biblical God. We know that God has lots of power, but what the nature of it is, then that is then the raising of the question of what kind of power can the God of love have? And there seem to be a lot of problematic answers, and the class starts to see that. But you hear, I don't just move right in saying, if you want to get an A in this class, you're going to have to give up the notion of an all-controlling deity, because that doesn't fit with the Bible or with process theology. Now, that's not how I proceed. But I want people to come to their own theology. And a lot of students get A's in my classes who still to this day have no problem calling God omnipotent. But I hope there's a subtlety and a nuance that, they have, that maybe that all power, they will translate as love power at some point in their sermons. So that even those who keep a pretty conservative language, I hope, have a few hints of the process thought coming through, the notion that it's actually more loving in your family, in your community, in your church. You're expressing more love if you can invite and lure transformation rather than just forcing it.
Yeah.
They get that, however conservative they might remain in their confessions.
I mean, even the example, right, of parenting, like a kid, an infant needs a different kind of relationship with the caregiver than a teenager and an adult. It reminds me of that spot, and I think it's in God in the World, where John makes the comment about, he calls it the monstrous idea at the heart of an ugly Christianity, right? And this is in his conversation with kind of Altizer and early radical theology of like the God that needs to die is the omnipotent one who is in complete control, yet holds you eternally responsible for your sin.
Right.
And he goes, I don't know how you connected these dots, but that's a monstrous deity. He's not worthy of worship kind of thing, and in the explanation of that, he goes to the parent image and he goes, are you a successful parent if you are the only parent in your kid's classroom, sitting over them, pointing and at, admonishing them to make sure they study, do their homework, pay attention, are respectful, and all that kind of stuff? That's not successful. You might actually do what you want, but you're being coercive, and it doesn't actually ultimately form them. Successful parents are the ones that relate to their children in ways that as they grow, they learn to internalize care for their neighbor, respect for elders, a value of learning. And then you get the report cards and you talk to the parents and see their friends and go, yeah, I'm not horrible at this. Right. Like, but they could have met all the goals. But if you're sitting there micromanaging, no one goes, what a powerful parent. Mm-hmm. I just love that.
That's a great example.
And I remember reading that early on and going, that's true. And so, like, so many times I feel like Christians go, you take the God is love, God is spirit, kind of thing. And then they go, well, what's the difference between a love of power and the power of love? And if you can't distinguish between the two, we have a problem, because like so often there's these run-ups where, because of our anxiety, our fear, and our worry about something being meaningless, intense pain or trauma or hurt, then we think the only solution for those intense experiences that weigh on us is for us to think that someone had a purpose in it.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the essential parts of how a process vision becomes compelling is both the freedom to recognize that life can be arbitrary, but God isn't.
Beautiful. Yeah.
And all the arbitrary moments are places that divine solidarity doesn't cease to be present.
Right.
that to me was one of those breakthroughs. And that's, I'm currently grading papers from people that read half of On the Mystery for their class. So they're telling me about Catherine Keller. And I think that one of the elements that you've captured real well is that in your work is the nature of mystery. And I think it's connected to your understanding or maybe the criticism of theology proper in the assertion of theopoetics. Now, if people are really interested in this, we have an hour-and-a-half conversation recorded about theopoetics, just theopoetics. They can go listen to. Yeah. But if this is their first time thinking of how the introduction of things like mystery, how the pushing aside of kind of logocentrism for the multiplicity and possibilities of poetics, how would you envision the way of seeing theology as process?
Right. Well, that's a really meaningful line of inquiry that you're pursuing, and I'm finding you're already answering it in ways that satisfying to me. But I'll just underscore what you're saying. Just that. Yeah, I think it's crucial to get at this theopoetics understanding. I think everyone gets poetics does have to do with the lure to beauty. There is something about the poetry of the universe, but more rigorously, poetics comes from that Greek poiesis, meaning to make, right, to create. So it's the kind of making that God does, and that in some sense is also making God, because God is taking part and is also becoming who God is in that moment. So that in that theopoetics is the unfolding relational process of all reality and of our reality in particular. And in our reality in particular, it is crucial, as you point out, to deal with that concern for purpose in suffering. I think that's just huge. Everyone faces some trials and tribulations in their life, some much more than others. But everyone has some experience of suffering, and it's those experiences that test whatever faith we think we have. And it is about whether we can find some purpose in suffering. But mostly for people, that means this traditional thing that God is causing this suffering so that I can be tested or so that I can learn. God is sending me these trials, this tribulation, to strengthen me, to teach me a lesson that I'll never forget, but whatever. And people feel like that gives them purpose in their suffering, even if it's rather gruesome to think that God caused the suffering. Still, it has a purpose. And if they're just faithful, they can get through it to God's more gracious side. I think in process theology, we don't want to just negate it and say, no, there's no purpose in suffering. We do want to say it isn't that God is causing the suffering in order to give purpose to your life. It isn't that God is causing the suffering at all. The suffering is happening because where you are in your reality at that time, that's your history. That's your world that's causing the suffering. God isn't causing things to happen. God's letting things happen. But God is offering that possibility at the moments of the worst suffering. And whatever that possibility is, that is a purpose. If you can tune to that divine purposiveness, that divine lure, then that does give you purpose in your suffering, and it will help you get through it. It will help you live that suffering with some dignity, with some wisdom, maybe eventually some serenity and some comfort, not necessarily right away, I mean, I would think in suffering, part of the divine lure is to help us to really process our suffering, to not repress it, then it'll just come back to bite us from behind. No, to understand our suffering, to try to understand its causes so we can help to rectify it, and we can get the help we need to rectify it from friends, from family, from therapists, from ideas, from the Bible, from God. So, yes, God gives purposes in suffering. That God is always sending purposes. That's what the lure is, but those aren't in control. Those are invitations for how to interpret, how to be more fully in that moment. And if it's a moment of trauma, how to survive it. Just how to survive, how to somehow remain myself and get to the next moment and the next moment, and then perhaps to get through that trauma, not to cut off from it, not to forget about it, but then to be able to process it. And so God is in there in our suffering, helping us to learn and grow, but God isn't causing the suffering in order to make us grow. That's really a big deal, isn't it, for people's coming to a freer and more mature understanding of their faith.
It reminds me of like how you would even interpret a few of those passages in Romans that get used in those times. Like in all things, God works for the good. Like a process like, yeah, but that doesn't mean all things are good.
Yes, right. Or God is causing all things for the good.
They're very different statements, or like neither heights nor depths nor anything. You go all the way down to Sheol and you can't escape the love of God in Christ Jesus. Right. Like in some sense that's a way of affirming that no matter what, just if you're speaking process, concrest, what just happened, the very next moment, the love of God entangled in the logos that was expressed in the person of Jesus meets you in the next moment, right? But the potentiality, the grace of an event happens, and you don't get to escape it because God's always already entangled up in the flux of becoming. And there are all these little moments where these passages of scripture that normally have those kind of unspoken assumptions, or, if you're thinking Whitehead, a kind of misplaced concreteness around the concept of God, that these abstractions exist. And then all of a sudden, the authority of these texts, these stories of Jesus, the history of Israel, become justifications for ideas that are ultimately problematize the encounter with the divine they're giving testimony to. And I think that is one of the things that you've spent time on, is cultivating a new kind of epiphanicism, or reflecting on the role and function of mystery as a theologian. I was talking with a student last week or so. When was the last time we saw a student? Sometime in the last 2 weeks, that had spent time reading more of your work after a little bit was assigned. And she said that she had never thought about seeing mystery as a recognition that God isn't just something we have inability or difficulty to talk about, but that the mystery is asserting a kind of strangeness that isn't something to be conquered. And that the natural intuition, especially for someone spending time mostly with analytic theologians, is that mystery is something that, when done well, gets dissolved or resolved. And that emphasis is not something that's shared by every process theologian.
No.
But it is for you. So I'd love for you to kind of share and unpack, and then how that part of your animating work connects to your kind of process vision in general.
Yeah, that is a tricky relationship, that attraction I have to mystery, to mysticism, does connect to my involvement in process theology, but not in obvious ways, because process theologians have been worried, very understandably, about the way mystery gets used in the Christian tradition. It's usually like that someone has some deep question, probably about what God is wanting from them, or why there's so much suffering in my life. Why is God letting this happen? That kind of question. And often the answer that really comes from the minister is, it's a mystery. You just have to take it on. You just have to trust God. You just have to take on faith that what's happening to you is the will of God, and we can't understand it. It's understandable that you're bothered, but just accept that God's will is a mystery. So it's often used when people are really needing some kind of explanation of why something's going so wrong or feeling so contradictory, and they're told just accept on faith that God's in control and it's going to be okay. It's a mystery. So that's often how we get it, that just accept what I'm telling you on faith. That God is good, God is just, and all things are in God's hands. And so whatever is happening to you is somehow the will of God. The will of God will be worked out through this. Just take that on faith. And I don't understand it. Yeah, it's a mystery. Just take it on faith. So it's often used instead of being able to really help someone come to a better understanding. Now, I understand why, I think we have to resort to mystery. I just think we don't have to resort quite that way. We don't have to appeal to mystery instead of having a pretty good account of how God works in the world. And that's what process theology is insisting on. It's not just that it's a mystery. God's in control of everything, and we can't understand why he lets evil happen. It's a mystery. That concept of mystery, process says no to, and I do too. And so process then comes up with a fairly detailed account of the God-world relation. And we've been sharing a fairly detailed account of a God whose power is that of a caring relationality, of love that calls and lures and doesn't control, etc., that takes everything into God's self. Okay, here's what I want to say. I want to resort to my favorite pre-20th century theologian. This takes me back to the 15th century, to 1440, to Nicholas of Cusa and his work, De Docta Ignorantia, on the ignorance of the faith. And he's out of that epiphatic tradition, that mystical tradition of unknowing, and makes clear it's because we're finite and God is not. God is actually infinite, that we can't get our minds around God. We can't know God. But he wants to say, but we can, by minding our ignorance, by knowing what we don't know, we can be learned in our ignorance. That's de docta ignorantia, the learned ignorance. We can be mindful of God, even in our mystery, our sense of mystery, and we can know something. And he says it's actually conjecturing, that we can then conjecture faithfully. And I think process theology conjectures very faithfully the way God works in the world. And it's not saying these are propositions that are certain and we have to take them as though they're like solid beliefs or facts. It's a very constructive conjecture. And I believe it opens us to a kind of infinite mystery. There's something that we know intuitively in the divine lure, but if we are really tuned to that divine lure, we know that we don't know for sure what God is asking or calling us to do, that it's intuitive, it's prayerful, it's meditative, that we have a sense and we can go with that on faith. And faith isn't knowledge. If it's knowledge, you don't need faith. So we can take on faith the sense of God's calling and luring us and work with it. And then we might find ourselves growing in faith in our life, becoming deeply enriched and shareable. And that is a kind of confirmation. But it's not proof. None of this is proof, like in science. It's not that kind of knowledge. It's a mysterious. And what I emphasize that's different from process theology is, that infinity of the divine. because for me, God kind of bottoms into that creative depth that is the category of the ultimate in Whitehead. It's creativity itself. It's not the same as God. I see it as the deep source of God's self, and therefore the depth of God. And that depth is infinite, and therefore new possibilities are being generated across all of space and time, which is massive and complex beyond what we can we can't even begin to comprehend the billions of galaxies that apparently make up our world, and then there might be others. So even the creation is just endlessly mysterious, and it's the expression, as Cusa said. Cusa is the one who really made clear that we can't fully know the universe, because the universe is created by God, and it's as much like God as possible. So it, he said, is infinite. And he is a theologian, is the first thinker to realize the non-finitude of the universe. Copernicus got it from Cusa. And it was Cusa who figured out, using this notion of the unknowability of God, right? He was using it to figure out things intellectually that no one knew. He figured out that the earth is not the center of the universe. Cusa figures it out in 1440, not Copernicus, 80, 90 years later. Cusa figured it out, and it's on the basis of that divine infinity that he meditates on the shape of then the universe, that it would have multiple centers, not just one center, and therefore the earth cannot be the center. And he went on to say what was inconceivable to Copernicus. He went on to say the sun is not the center either. No sun, no planetary body is the center. So you see, great knowledge can come out of this attention to mystery. That's the point here. But it's a modest knowledge that conjectures about God and the universe, but it might be coming up with much better knowledge than those who think they know for sure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So how would your kind of vision, your kind of theopoetics, thinking of the theology as process and stuff, change the way you understand truth? I mean, a lot of people will hear theology's task is faith-seeking understanding. And one of the things you pointed out, I don't know where, but it's in my stack of notes related to things you've written. So it's in my document called Catherine Keller. Is that you said that when faith-seeking understanding turns into belief that understands, it's no longer on the way or seeking, it's dead. And it was one of those times I thought, see, this was before you had a Twitter account, Catherine, because that's high quality Twitter material. but underneath it is this assumption that truth isn't so much something you arrive at, but it's the character of an interaction and a doing and such that for people that may assume Christianity and then it being in process, thinking of the title of class, is an uneasy relation. How do you understand the truth of Christianity and it being in process?
I mean, I understand it rather biblically. If we want to go to the heart of the truth doctrine of Christianity, we might as well, go to the Gospels. We might as well go to John, citing Jesus as saying in one of the I am statements, right? And the way, light, and the truth. So if that great I am that is incarnate there is the truth, that truth is the way. Now, of course, Christians are prone to take it as, all about the definite article. I am the way, the light, the truth. I'm more thinking the emphasis is on the way, light, the truth. And that's what this I am is about, that who says I am the way, so if you're not on the way, you're not with the truth. And being on the way means, being in motion. It means being in process. It means you're not already there yet. You're not dead and finished. Neither have you reach some eternal perfection. So there's nothing more dynamic to me than that concept of being on the way, but in this way, following the one who is that way, and therefore you're really being in the very life of that one by being on the way. So I'd say it's pretty core to what Christology, Christologos is about, isn't it? This logos, who is the word in the Gospel of John. It's a high Christology. The other Gospels don't talk quite like that. But when we want to do Christology, we need to land there and correct some of the distortions of that high Christology that have made it static and lose that dynamism of the process of the way. And truth, people get taught that that's something that you have and you hold on to. So yes, you don't have to be on the way to find it, to keep finding it. Even if you have it, is it possible that you have to stay on the way and keep rediscovering in each new moment, in some sense, some refreshment of that truth? I love the Greek word that's then the biblical Greek in John for truth. It's aletheia, and means what? It means uncovering, unveiling. So actually, it's a kind of synonym for apocalypsis, another New Testament text, which also, apocalypsis also means to unveil. It's quite a synonym for aletheia, to uncover. So there's a sense of discovering that is the truth. And if something's not opening up for you, then it's not truth yet.
Yeah. Well, even something that comes to mind just in the way you laid that out is throughout the New Testament, you get phrases like in the truth, in the light, in love. All of those are real participatory images, yes. Right? And if you think of just like even the in love thing, like it does me no good to if I make a fool of myself or I'm snarky at an inappropriate time and hurt Alicia's feelings and be like, no, we're in love. That's what we're doing right now. We're in love right now. She's like, no, I think you should really take responsibility for what you said. And I don't know where it was coming from. It wasn't really called for it. I'm like, no, but we're in love. That fixes it, right? Like, can't you get over, in love, or like if God's in you, you're going to live in the light. Like there's so many of those things have these participatory images. And I find that there is this temptation in a lot. It runs through any ideology, is that you would like to abstract and concretize as something so that then you can possess it and dole it out.
Have it.
And then you're the mediator for whether you're in it. Yeah. But there's only one way to know if the love you have between a person's reciprocal. Mm. It's being vulnerable to the mystery of each other's subjectivity. Mm-hmm. The moment someone else becomes an object to you and they don't get to grow and flow with the changing of life and your relationship with them, that relationship's dead. And I think that sometimes our fear of wanting to know whether we are known completely and loved completely, mm-hmm. that we resist the vulnerability of that kind of love with the divine, and then insist on a concretized, abstracted one that we can dole out and then have securely. And that's like not nearly as intoxicating. You would never use divine arrows for that kind.
Yeah. No, I just would say amen. Right. If we're in love or if we're in God, it's precisely because we're in it and we don't control it. We don't have it. It isn't in our hands. It isn't even contained in our hearts. It's saturating our being. If we're in love, the love is much bigger than who we are, and our participation in it is what opens us to then each other in that love. It's because of the mutuality, as you say, that there is the love flow, and therefore that we're in it. It's in that participatory energy that the the flow takes place. So we're in the waters of that love. And that's a perfectly good parallel or even translation of what it is to be in God. And we don't have God. We don't even have our faith in God like something that we possess and can control, because then God is an object over there whom we might love or believe in, or, or worship as an object. But that's not participation. That's not being in the love of God. That's not being in the God of love.
Okay, so we're running out of time, and we didn't even get to the apocalypse. You hinted at it, but I will forever, especially everyone in the class, I will link to and attach the video at your book release party that we had for your new book, and the previous conversation, Facing the Apocalypse, is the new one. And then was it 20 years before you wrote your first book on the apocalypse? Is that
almost 96 that came out?
Okay. So you've gone to the apocalypse twice. Not normal for a theologian that doesn't have a chart that includes Daniel 17, Revelation 4, and foreign policy advice. But for people that are discovering process thought now, like, what are those kind of key insights? And then as to how to reframe the doctrine of eschatology in a process key. And we'll link to the books and our previous conversations so we can hear it in full. But I just think that, so often the criticisms towards more progressive kinds of Christianity is that you just get rid of doctrines. And I don't think that's accurate, but it's good slander. And I find both of your books, compelling and powerful. So what would be the invitation to think through the apocalypse in a process key?
Yeah. And in general, yes, I agree. The point isn't to give up doctrines, but to understand the word doctrine means teaching. Let's keep it a gerund. It's an ing. It's a process going on. It's teaching, this biblical text and the tradition are teaching us, and we're teaching each other, and we're learning, and therefore we're interpreting and coming up with fresh interpretations that allow us to be teaching these ancient insights in new contexts. And the apocalypse is one of those that sort of belongs to the doctrine of eschatology, so-called end things, that needs endlessly to be taught again. First of all, eschatology with eschatos. Eschatos doesn't just mean end; it means edge. It's a spatial metaphor as much as it is temporal. So the end, the eschatos is the edge of my computer or of my table. It's not just about the end. And so there's a relativity to the ends, but some ends are much more dramatic than others. And of course, final judgment is a very dramatic metaphor of some kind of ultimate revelation of the meaning of what's come about of all of our lives together. But what I have needed to do a little obsessively with the apocalypse, since I'm not a biblical scholar, I wasn't originally even attracted to the text at all back in the last millennium when I wrote the first book. So what is it that gets me into this? Well, the 96 book, Apocalypse Now and Then, the subtitle is A Feminist Approach to the End of the World. Apocalypse Now and Then, I was clearly trying to relativize apocalypse already with the title. So I was very worried as I started doing this thinking. I was doing it in the 80s. It took me a long time to write that book, about 10 years almost. But I got started on that path because I was so worried about the election of Ronald Reagan and his alliance with Jerry Falwell. And their agreement, these two old guys agreed that the world was going to come to an end by nuclear exchange during their lifetimes. And this is the president, is on the record agreeing about this. And he has his finger, over the nuclear bomb button. He has the codes. He could make it happen if he believes it's God's will. So this really scared me. So that got me into looking at how the religious right had become inseparable from the political right, and how the apocalypse was a crucial dynamism in that. But while doing that, I began to understand that that is not like, the only way to read the book of Revelation. In fact, I gradually became aware that this religious right-wing use of the book of Revelation that would lead eventually to some kind of total destruction was unfaithful to the book of Revelation, and that the values of the book of Revelation are the values of the Hebrew prophetic tradition. They're values of justice, of social justice and mercy. And the whore of Babylon and the beast. Yes, the whore is a sexist image, but the whore of Babylon represents the global economy of the Roman Empire, and the beast represents the political power of the Roman Empire that totally dominated and squished little Israel that was already the victim of prior empires. And so the Jews understand themselves, and the early Christians, who were like John, many still Jews, understand themselves to be, victimized by the beast of imperial power. Whereas the fundamentalist use tends to really want to beef up American imperial power and its economy. So I got into it trying to, sort of in that pushback against 20th century forms of fundamentalism and religious political power. But why did I come back to it again? Well, facing apocalypse, I got into because, and I didn't want to. I mean, I thought when I finished the other apocalypse book, I wouldn't have to come back to it again in the next millennium, hopefully.
I mean, no one picks to face the apocalypse twice.
That's right. Really. And I just assumed if we made it to the 21st century, maybe the threat of nuclear apocalypse would be behind us, et cetera. Well, I hope that's true. But what began to face me and face all of us is climate change. And I started seeing all over the place references to the apocalypse in relation to the environment. And a lot of the references weren't hysterical and weren't at all fundamentalist and weren't saying it's all over. But, and I quote in my book a lot of these headlines, like from the LA Times, about the California wildfire apocalypse, et cetera. But there is an awareness of terrible destruction happening already and on the horizon to happen in much worse form. And it seems like there's no metaphor that's strong enough to name this except apocalyptic, that the threat of climate change is apocalyptic. It threatens terrible doom. And that seemed right to me at that edge, but it seemed crucial then to get in there and just make as clear as possible to as broad an audience as possible that apocalypse does not mean the end of the world, that in the Bible, there is no the end of the world. There is huge catastrophe, and it is depicted surreally in the book of Revelation, so that there's vast death of human populations, non-human populations, elemental destruction. It's not the end of the world, and that language is not used. And the apocalypse, the word itself, means to unveil, to disclose, not to close down. So what's being disclosed? Well, it is being disclosed that our being captive as a species to imperial power and greed is leading to unbearable levels of destruction of human life and of the non-human integrity of the planet. Terrible destruction. But finally, that comes to a head. There is the revelation of the evil as evil. It's very surreal. It's dreamy. These are visions, not descriptions of a set future. They're dream metaphors. And there's the dreamy appearance of the New Jerusalem. And who's she? The bride of the bloody lamb, very symbolic, a very queer marriage between a bloody lamb and a city. But what is that? Well, it's not what fundamentalists make it out to be, just the supernatural new creation after the old world has been terminated. No, it's that there's radical transformation, but it's not a supernatural new world. What do you have? You have a gate with, a city with walls. Why would you have walls if it were heaven? And all the gates are open, though, 24/7. And who comes in? Well, what's depicted coming in is all the rulers of the earth bringing their glory, it says, into the New Jerusalem. So the nations are all there. The nation states and their rulers, the forms of government of the ancient world are still envisioned. So these are human governments, human representatives coming in, but coming in peacefully into the city, and the city that's centered in what? Well, the tree of life growing on both sides, like Pando Populus, growing on both sides of the river of the water of life. So in dream symbolism, it seems to me this expresses a radical eco-civilization. And it's an ecological city, ecological urban civilization in which the nations still have their integrity. It's still our planet with our political organizations, but they've gone through radical transformation, perhaps finally awakened through so much crisis. Their eyes are open and they're making utter peace with one another and sharing their glory for the good of all. So it's just not about the end of the world and then a kind of supernatural plop down. And that seemed to me very important, that it is, it's a 2,000-year-old book, and it's not predicting. Prophecy is not prediction. I say about 10 times in my book. Prophecy is not prediction of facts that are already set in stone. God hasn't set anything in stone. If God had planned everything to work out the way it is working out, then God is responsible for all the evil. So let's not worry about it. We can't do anything anyway. We can't be anything other than we are. That's just bad faith. But what prophecy does mean, not the prediction of some set future, it means actually what I call a kind of a dream reading of the future. It's a reading of patterns that are set very deep, including the patterns of empire and power and greed. It reads those deep patterns that are so entrenched that they're going to play themselves out over much too long a time and in destructive ways. And the prophets don't know how long it'll be. They have no idea. They're relevant 2,000 years into the future. But these are very dreamy visions or nightmarish visions. And they both warn and alert and awaken and comfort and promise. They offer possibilities, that the divine possibility. They spark the I see the gems, the endless gems that make up the walls of the New Jerusalem as like symbolizing the divine possibilities, those endless eternal lures or eternal objects, Whitehead calls them, just sparkling eternal possibilities are gathered, but that we might evolve as a civilization to the point that we could live in peace with each other and in harmony with the ecology of the creation. It's a real possibility. That's a good place to end, isn't it?
Once you pull out the possibility fingers, and they're like the theological version of like Fosse hands, right? Like for the musical theater people in the back. But I love that invitation. I'll definitely link to more of Catherine's work when it comes to the apocalypse, but I've really enjoyed getting to talk to you, and I was looking forward to it all day, and you exceeded my expectations. So when you look at this little appointment on your calendar book, you should underline it and check it off, because it was tons of fun. And I really appreciate you sharing parts of your own story and the way it ended up framing your theological questions you've carried.
Well, thank you, Trip. I'm glad that I hadn't scheduled anything else for the later afternoon, because this really was a conversation that lured us both into more than either of us were expected. And I just so much admire the the depth and the order, and yet an order at the edge of chaos by which you are able to spontaneously frame and reframe your questions and really carry on this kind of conversation trip. It's beautiful, transformative work that you do, and I recognize in it. I won't say the hand of God, that's too manipulative. But I do recognize a lot of those sparkling gems of possibility right there in your language and in your eyes. So thank you.
Oh, it's been a blast.